Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author and PhD in literature. Today, we are going to look at one very, very short story. The reason why this sounds so compelling to me is because during the course of, say, an hour, we are going to really be able to dive into one whole complete story. I will be reading the entire story to you. I'll be reading it, with a couple of different explications here and there. In fact, probably a lot of explication. But you will have to bring nothing to the party. You do not have to have read this beforehand. You don't have to know what the story's about, what the writer's all about. I will fill you in on some of those important details, but mostly together we will get to revel in just the experience of being able to dig into all of the elements that make these short stories, the ones I'm going to collect, incredibly powerful pieces of literature and ones that we can indulge in all at once together without any preparation. And we are going to kick off this series of short story explorations with Argos, which is a short story by Joy Williams in her new collection, The Pelican Child. Joy Williams is a writer I have loved for so long. Her writing is very difficult in some ways and very dark in some ways. I also find it just illuminating and funny and so challenging in ways that are really feel really good on your brain. The work that I love the best of hers is called The Quick and the Dead. That is a novel that I read not long after it came out in 2000, and I loved it so much. I remember just feeling like it was one of these kind of seminal novels, like something that really affirmed my love of literature. But I have to say that I went back and looked at it. I was going to take it back up and do a seminar on it. And this was, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. I picked it up and I couldn't do it. I couldn't read it. It was so kind of harrowing. And honestly, when that happens to me, I'm actually always very impressed. What that means is this is a piece of literature that I read at one moment and it really resonated with me, but it is a piece of literature that is so powerful that I was not, in fact, able to continue with it. That happened to me with White Noise by Don DeLillo. That was a book I couldn't even... There are very few books that I've put down because they're so upsetting. That was one of them. But it does go to show the power of literature. I was really excited this year, last year, at the end of 2025, when Joy Williams' collection came out to enormous critical acclaim. Argos is a story that's in some ways kind of typical of her writing and in other ways really not typical of her writing. And we're going to discuss why that is. But it is, I think, a really incredible piece to look at in terms of understanding what it is that she's up to and why her work is really effective. As we move through these stories here at the Foxed Page, they're going to have to be very, very short. I realized that they have to be really short in order for me to be able to read the entirety of the story to you and to be able to give you some sort of explanation. So the agenda is very simple for those of you who like an agenda. We're going to talk very briefly about Joy Williams, mostly about her publication history, a little bit about her education. And then we're going to just go ahead and dive into this piece of work. And part of what is so compelling about this, and it speaks to this idea of me being able to read the entire story at the end, once you have a real grip on why it's so special, part of the enticement there is that it is so lovely to be read to. And, we do a lot of this these days with audio versions of books, and I love that. A lot of people will sort of be sheepish about the fact that they listen to books instead of reading them these days, as if it's somehow kind of like a lesser, form of consumption of literature. And actually, part of me thinks it might just be a tiny bit lesser, only in the sense that I think we tend to listen to things while we are doing other things. So you might be a bit more distracted if you are walking your dog and listening to a book than if you were sitting down reading said book. Still, I think it's an amazing way to consume literature. And if it is allowing you to read more, then I am all for it. At this moment, I'm also going to put in a quick plug. If you are sitting and actually reading a physical book, I would always counsel you to read with a pencil in hand. I make all sorts of marks, all sorts of notes. Everything's kind of random, stars, checks, underlining, circling, all sorts of different things. And lots of marginalia, lots of notes, lots of exclamation marks, and sometimes no with 15 O's when something is just not sitting well with me. I hardly ever go back and look at that stuff. I do sometimes when I'm pulling together a lecture, but the point is not to be making notes that you will then go back and consult. The point is to be interacting a little more with the text. I always find that I'm more engaged if I am reading with a pencil in hand. So I am clearly not someone who reads, audio versions of books professionally, but I like to think that hopefully some of what's going to happen here is you're going to have ideally a familiar voice. Hopefully you're a longtime listener of the Foxed Page, or you'll become one. And toward the end of each of these, I will read these very short stories to you in a way that hopefully will feel like a worthwhile literary experience. Okay, we're going to dive in and talk very briefly about Joy Williams. She was born in 1944. She's 81 years old. She was born in Massachusetts, but she was raised in Maine. She was an only child. This is all from Wikipedia. Her father was a minister, as was her grandfather. And to me, that's kind of like a potent situation there. You've got an only child being raised in Maine, which I always think of as being somewhat remote and rural. Although, I don't know, maybe she was in like Portland or something. But the idea, too, of having like multiple generations of ministers makes things sound, very like puritanical and very kind of New England in lots of ways to me. And because her writing is very dark in some ways and is very kind of honest and forthright about some of the real difficulties that we are facing as human beings, it makes sense to me in some ways. I mean, I'm, again, imagining these ministers as being kind of like fire and brimstone types, and maybe they were not. But we can just say that I was not surprised to hear that she was raised. In fact, also weird that they didn't mention anything about her mom, or maybe not weird, maybe totally typical. But it seems like perhaps she also was in a pretty patriarchal situation. And I think I could probably argue that a lot of what she is doing is pushing a little bit against those patriarchal forces. She was at the Iowa Writers Workshop, which is, kind of like the first and foremost, it's like the most prestigious writing program that we have in the United States. She was there with Raymond Carver and with Richard Yates. I was listening to I think it was a BBC thing, and they were talking about her, and they said that she studied under Raymond Carver, and I was very resentful to hear that, because in fact she studied with him. But again, the patriarchy is really like asserting itself here, and it actually was a British man who was talking with like a very patriarchal, well, not like a very patrician, I should say, kind of British accent. But let us be clear that she studied with those two giants, Raymond Carver and Richard Yates. Richard Yates wrote, of course, Revolutionary Road. Raymond Carver, that is a master of the short form. That is for certain. And I love Raymond Carver's work. I did a lecture on him if you are interested in that. And what's notable to me is that Joy Williams's writing seems very different and seems unique in a way. It's not a part of this kind of dirty realism that we had with Carver and with people like Richard Ford, with that whole generation of men that were, very caught up with the idea of being men. She was married for 34 years to the fiction editor of Esquire magazine until he died, I think in 2008. She has written 5 novels and a bunch of different short story collections. Again, my favorite is The Quick and the Dead from the year 2000. That was nominated, it was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. And I love looking at Wikipedia just to see what these descriptions of people's work make of their stuff. And this one was just like, it seemed on some level like very accurate, but also just like such a bizarre sort of assessment of her work. It says that Joy Williams writes about life as a downward spiral addressing various forms of failure in the USA from spiritual, ecological, and economic perspectives. I mean, it's kind of true. Like a lot of it is very dark and a lot of it's like a kind of a downward spiral. And there is a lot of failure, but it seems like such a kind of melodramatic way to describe this. I do actually also really like the environmental piece of her writing. And it does feel very spiritual. So in some ways, this is very accurate. I'm not sure why it really struck me as so odd. Maybe it was just downward spiral. Things kicked off in kind of an odd way. This collection has been nominated for a National Book Award. And in the Wikipedia entry, someone was quoted as saying, like, this is the kind of collection that like really firmly puts her in the running for the Nobel Prize for Literature, which I love that. That's great. So good for Joy. And I want to just, before we dive in, note that in 1995, Joy Williams, she wrote the introduction for the collection of like the best American short stories of that year. And she wrote something that was so interesting to me. What she said is, all art is about nothingness, our apprehension of it, our fear of it, its approach. And that is such an excellent segue into the short story that we are going to look at. So I think the reason why this story, Argos, as having to do with nothingness, I think that will become apparent as we are reading on. But I want to dive into the book. I don't want to spoil anything right from the top here of this like 3-page story. We are, just so you're situated, on page 80, kind of like right in the middle of the short story collection. I'm sure a lot of people are aware of this, but I like to keep in mind the fact that the way that like a writer will put together a collection is really important. The title story is, of course, very important. The first story is always really important. You want something, that's really going to like get your reader going. And then you want something at the end that's also going to be very strong. I think in this case, having a short little story right in the middle and one that really packs a punch is a very good idea in terms of keeping the reader moving. Importantly, this story, Argos, comes from XO Orpheus, 50 New Myths. That came out in 2013. So as those of you who know mythology might have gathered, Argos is the name of the dog in the Odyssey. So this is not Ulysses. I mean, it is Ulysses because Odysseus and Ulysses are the same guy. But this is Odysseus's dog. So what's important here is I think, I'm not a classics scholar by any stretch. I did read an incredible translation of the Odyssey a little while ago by a woman named Emily Henry. Really like an exceptional translation because it really made the whole thing feel very readable. I think that's her name. Suddenly I'm doubting myself. If you're on YouTube, I will put up a cover of that book so you have a sense. I believe it's Emily Henry. I will confirm whether or not that is her name. So somewhere deep in my terrible memory, it did ring a bell that Argos was going to have to do with the Odyssey. But it's very important if you are Joy Williams and you want to write a successful short story, you have to write one that, if it's growing out of Greek mythology, that's amazing. And we'll talk about why. But it also has to be totally accessible to anyone who doesn't know the Odyssey, someone who has never read it before. The reason why this is important is because if you are someone who knows a bit about the Odyssey, maybe you have a terrible memory, but you happen to read a translation a few years ago, it's going to be very flattering to you because you have this kind of vague recollection. And then as you're going through, you're like, oh, right, I remember this, I remember that, like that answers this question, or it reminds me of this other issue. But if you have not read it, you also need to be kind of like flattered as you are moving through. I mean, I think most people who are reading a Joy Williams collection have at least heard of the Odyssey. They've heard of Homer, or at least when their memory is jarred, they're like, oh, wait, this is ringing a vague bell. She threads this needle so incredibly well. As someone who knows a bit about it, I was just flattered, and like I felt like I was kind of that my appreciation of Homer and the Odyssey was just like really deepened. But I also could imagine a world where if you didn't know it at all, if you didn't know the Odyssey or anything about Argos, you still would be on very firm footing. So the first thing we're going to look at, of course, is the title. Especially with a short story, the title takes on a huge amount of importance. I had an MFA professor who told us that you should look at the title of a short story as almost like the first line of the short story. And in this case, it's very like kind of on the nose, and it is focusing our attention in a really important way. The title of the story is Argos, Argos. I mentioned the spelling because oftentimes Argus with the U is another version of how you would spell this dog's name. And Argus, it's a Greek word. This is coming from Greek mythology. It's an epic poem that was written, or it comes from the epic poem written by Homer. But in Greek, Argus, I thought it meant gold, which is not too far off the mark, but it means shining or brightness. The reason why I was confusing it with gold is because AU, that's like the chemical sign for gold, that comes from the Latin word aurum, which means a shining dawn. You might also, when you think of Argos, you might think of, Jason and the Argonauts. Okay, so we are pretty firmly situated in Greek mythology here, but we're also really like kind of on a very intimate level with this one creature who is the dog in the book. So, and actually there are lots and lots of dogs throughout all of, I say the book, I mean the epic poem. There are lots of dogs all throughout Joy Williams's work. And in fact, lots of them are talking dogs, which is always so excellent. I think in many ways, Joy Williams is very like post-humanist. So when Joy Williams is giving these dogs voice, it's this very important way, I think, that she's elevating all sorts of different life forms, not just, prizing man as the ultimate form of life. So we're going to dive in here to Argos. Perhaps you've read of me. I am the hound, old Argus. I once belonged to the hero Odysseus some 2,800 years ago. Homer granted me a few lines in his epic. He presented me then in a pathetic light. So a couple of things to note right from the start. We have this kind of somewhat archaic literature, even perhaps, like we would use maybe, I think would be kind of the more, like casual way to say that. But perhaps is a little bit elevated. And then this thing, I am the hound, old Argus. That to me, it sounds very Shakespearean. It sounds very kind of classical. The way that syntax works, it's nicely declarative in the beginning. I am the hound, old Argus. You might just say like, I'm the old hound, Argus. But we have this idea of I am the hound, old Argus, that sounds, very old. It's also very important to note right at the start here that we have direct address. So this idea of perhaps you've read of me. So we have this I, you thing. This is a first person narration. It's the voice of Argus. It's the voice of the dog. But any kind of I, any first person narrative is setting up this idea of I and you. Even if it's very subtle, the reader understands that we are like the recipient of whatever it is that this narrator is telling us. I love direct address. That's when you is mentioned. So here you have this idea, perhaps you've heard of me. It's also so beautiful that right from the start, Joy Williams is giving us a certain amount of kind of like this archaic tone, this kind of formality and like perhaps, and like I am the hound, old Argus. But there's also kind of a casual, intimate nature here when it says, perhaps you've heard of me. I keep saying heard. Maybe it's because, these poems, these epic poems were meant to be read out loud, but she is saying read. Perhaps you've read of me, which is a very important distinction, actually. But when she says perhaps you've read of me, it's a contraction. It's YOU apostrophe VE. So we have this sense of like things being somewhat casual, even though this is sort of this more archaic language. And then when he says, I once belonged to the hero Odysseus some 2,800 years ago, the fact that this is like an estimation also feels kind of chatty. It feels like we're just having a conversation with someone who's kind of trying to remember how long ago Homer wrote this epic. It's also, though, doing this incredible work where we're hearing Odysseus, Homer, we're given years, like very subtly and with this very intimate and archaic voice, she is settling us so well in time. So all of the things that we need to know, we know he's a hound, we know that the hero Odysseus was his owner, we know that he is, that we're talking about an epic poem by Homer, and we know that it's almost 3,000 years old. All of that is so, so powerful. So at the end of that very first short paragraph, it says he, and here we're talking, this is the dog still, Argus talking, and when he says he means Homer. He presented me then in a pathetic light, : and then we have some actual text that has been taken from some version of the Odyssey, and it's in italics. So he presented me in a pathetic light, cast away on piles of dung from mules and cattle, infested with ticks, half dead from neglect. So a couple of important things here. When Argos is telling us that he's being presented in a pathetic way, it's both pathetic in kind of like our normal sense of that word, but also when you have someone who's talking about Homer and epic poetry, you need to think about pathos, like in the Greek sense. So, and pathetic, ultimately what it means is something that inspires sadness or pity, but we use it in this kind of like derogatory way, like if something's really pathetic. What I think we're meant to do here is, yes, in some ways this is like pathetic and he's all grimy and gross and like, has infestation of fleas. But we're also, it's this idea of really wanting to elicit pathos, some sort of pity and some sort of sorrow that we are supposed to feel about Argus. So I'm going to make a very important note at this point too. The idea of her situating us in time and like pulling this character from this really important epic poem is underscored by the way that she is then pulling out some actual words of Homer. Obviously they're translations, but she's giving us a piece of this epic poem in a way that makes the whole thing feel so much more legitimate. And there's this real sense of gravitas, like we're basically like dipping a toe into the Odyssey by Homer, which is this beautiful thing because it elevates what she's trying to do here, but it doesn't take away from the fact that we're still learning this very intimate story about this sad old dog. Like it's supposed to be elevated because it is classical literature of like the most important stripe, but it also is very approachable and very clear and very pathetic in the sense that it is bringing sorrow for us. So then we move on. After we have the word neglect, we have a space break and then we continue. I had waited for my absent master for 20 years, and when he returned, he came in the guise of a beggar, a mangy tramp, a bag of bones. So a lot is made in scholarship of the fact that this incident, this is a huge part in the Odyssey. This is when Odysseus is returning home after 20 years of being gone. He had left Penelope behind. He's doing the Trojan Wars. All of these things are happening. He's coming home. And this is the end of the poem. This is really like, the sort of culmination of the whole entire thing. It's a very big deal. And a lot is made, again, of Argos because there's a bit of a time stamp here. It's one of the times where we hear in the poem that it has been 20 years. It's like a very important like foothold for scholars. And a lot is made, too, of the fact that when Odysseus comes back, his dog is kind of this doppelganger for him. The dog is like, like grimy and infested with fleas and sitting on a pile of dung. But Ulysses is also like mangy it's so good the way she uses mangy. Not everyone says mangy. They might say he's like scabrous or something, like he's all kind of gross. And he's, dressed like a beggar and certainly is unrecognizable for everyone. Except his dog, importantly. But I love the fact that Joy Williams is calling him mangy because that's obviously an adjective that we really identify with dogs. She's underscoring the fact that in many ways, Odysseus and Argos are meant to be read as the same sort of creature. As you might imagine, the parallels between the two of them are not just in their like physical form, but we're meant to think of them both as being incredibly loyal. Like this is a dog who, hung on this whole entire time and like didn't lose faith in his master. In much the same way that Odysseus, was always trying to return home, more or less. So we have this idea of them, the timestamp and them being fairly similar. And then we go on. This was calculation, the deception, the final triumphant wile of the wily Odysseus. I love that. The wile of the wily Odysseus as a prose like stylist, she is so, so good. Then we move on. I alone recognized him. I thumped my tail in joy, though I hadn't the strength to drag myself an inch toward him. He did not acknowledge me. Crusher. Absolute crusher. So I love the way that just in terms of like the format of this page, that is a sentence that is standing on its own. It's at the very bottom of the page. It's so beautifully set off in this way that really makes the impact so much stronger. It's plain, it's declarative. There's no frills here. We just have this really sad moment where it says, he did not acknowledge me. So then we move on. He did not place his hand on my bony head or stroke my withered flanks. A friendly touch from him would have meant the world to me, of course. I had often dreamed of his return, which I had long associated with happiness. So we have this kind of interesting slowing down. In the first brief page, there's lots of space on the page. We have that little excerpt from the actual epic poem. We have a lot of information. We're hearing about Odysseus and Homer, and we have all of this kind of a lot of is happening here. Odysseus returns. He doesn't recognize Argus. It's not that tons of action is happening, but in relatively short space, a lot is. And then things begin to kind of slow down a little bit and dilate, and we're getting a little more information here. Things are expanding a bit. So he's giving us more information about what did not happen in this beautiful description of how people are with their dogs. There's this real sense of longing because this is, of course, what Argus wanted and he did not get. It's so beautiful. The idea of his bony head or stroke my withered flanks. There's something about withered flanks there that is so beautiful. And even just this very declarative thing about how I had often dreamed of his return, which I had long associated with happiness. It's such a clear declaration of what he wanted and did not get. And then we have this sentence. It's all part of that same, it's the first paragraph on this second page. I cannot tell you why his wife and son did not take care of me those long years, or why their servants were so cruel. There is much that animals do not understand. This is so incredibly satisfying. So it does take a tiny bit of knowledge of the Odyssey to kind of appreciate this. So in the Odyssey, none of this is explained. We know that Argos is totally neglected. Odysseus, when he was young, he raised this dog up and he turned him into this incredible hunter and this loyal beast. And then he left and didn't get to kind of enjoy, the fruits of his labors. But they were, a very close kind of dog, dog owner, dog person. But it is a little mysterious. There are a couple of lines about how everyone neglected him. And as the reader, you're like, wait, why? Why was everybody so neglectful of this dog? So it is incredibly satisfying when Joy Williams is like, I don't know why, Penelope and Telemachus weren't better to me. And I don't know why all of their servants were so cruel to me. Because you as the reader are like, oh my God, right. There's this real question of why? In some ways you're like, wait, did Homer you can think about this in a very scholarly way, but as the casual reader, you're like, I feel like he should explain to us a little more why everyone's not being more careful or more, caring of Argos. So it's so satisfying because she's not trying to give us an explanation. She's simply like telling us, yes, you are correct that you are curious why everybody was so neglectful of like this beloved creature who was, basically like an extension of Odysseus, who is now gone. So it's this unique thing that's happening because I think a lesser writer would want to try to like provide some like backstory as to why he's neglected. And basically it's just Joy Williams is totally, pushing against that and is like, oh, I don't know why. No one knows why. And what is so beautiful is then she ends with this sentence: there is so much that animals do not understand. And what happens in that little turn there is you as a reader are meant to feel like an animal. There's so much that we don't understand. Maybe Homer understood and just was like withholding information. But there's so much that people and dogs and everyone, there's so much mystery in the world. And this is one of them. And Joy Williams is underscoring it, but she's not trying to give us any kind of explanation or backstory. It's so masterfully done. Then we move on. I do know, however, that Homer did not invent me, which is such a twist. You're like, wait, what? Like, where are we going now? Because before, merely one page before, we were on such firm footing. Like, we know who Homer is. We're given years, it's like about 3,000 years ago, this epic poem was written. We know most of us who, wow, if you heard that big clanging noise, that was my own beloved hound. Oh, and there's the second one. Both of my beloved hounds are apparently making their way out into the rain. But what we have here is Joy Williams now just like fully going off-piste in a way that is so satisfying. So he says, I do know, however, that Homer did not invent me. This is the perfect use of this very declarative, very authoritative kind of language. And the reader's interest is so piqued because we're like, wait, what? Who invented you? He goes on, Argos, the narrator goes on. I was always Argos. It is Homer indeed who in all probability did not exist as an individual, his words being the imaginings of many. And that's interesting because I'm not a classics scholar, but apparently she's alluding to something along the lines of like people believing that Shakespeare could not have been one man who wrote all of that work, and that, or like the authors of the Bible, these hugely important, like ancient texts are often said to be written by many people. I did not know that about Homer, but it's so great because I was like, okay, that makes sense to me. I have kind of like a blueprint for this with the Bible and with Shakespeare. So again, we have her lining herself up. Like she's putting this piece of very short fiction into this long, long line of incredibly important texts. And then she's like moving beyond a little bit. It's so excellent. So we have this idea that Homer was many people, not just one individual. And then we have this kind of curious thing. In the same paragraph, it says this. It was even said that Ulysses flicked away a tear when he beheld me, though I did not see it, as the hero had turned his back on me. So that's kind of curious because we have this idea of like Homer didn't invent me. Like Homer is not an actual individual. Like Argos in many ways is like more of like a real entity because we know exactly who he is. He's the dog of Odysseus, whereas there's a lot of like mystery around the idea of Homer. But then we have this kind of detail about how Odysseus may have like flicked away a tear as he is seeing his dog. But because it is situated with this idea of these many voices, we have this idea that some like this one detail about their reunion is just like it's one possibility of what might have happened. And that allows us to see that Joy Williams in this incredible way is stepping in as like another voice who is adding like to the story of Argus. This is Joy Williams is stepping in like literally in the same way that Homer, or one of the many Homers, was creating Argus. She's continuing this idea of what this dog is and what it represents. He represents. So moving on after the hero turned his back from his old trusty hound. This subterfuge was necessary for his success. So had the goddess Athena counseled him. To be recognized was to be betrayed. He strode away from me and into the palace halls to claim his kingdom, slay the insolent suitors. 100 of them he killed in an instant, and regain his wife Penelope. His triumph was thus achieved, and little happens after. As for me, this is how I am dismissed by the Homers. So once again, we have this compressed situation, much like in the beginning when we had, the idea of Homer, Odysseus, Argus, the year, all of this stuff was introduced in one short paragraph. Here, we have the entire ending of it He strides into his kingdom. He slays all of the suitors. He reclaims his wife. We have one sentence. They're just these quick phrases. So the entirety of this epic poem, or the conclusion of it, is squashed into this small-ish piece. And then things are going to start slowing down and dilating again as we find out the fate of Argos. And I love the way, too, that he's using the plural for Homers here. He's like, here's what happens to me according to the Homers. Like, he's still this one stable entity where the Homers are now like this kind of like mishmash of people. This is also an excerpt from the Odyssey. It's in italics, just like the part before. So this is what the Homers say. Then his destiny released old Argus, soon as he had lived to see Odysseus in the 20th year restored. So again, we have this idea of that important timestamp. But what we have here is that Argus is dying. So the minute that Odysseus comes back and he's triumphant and, like the thing is ending in this very victorious kind of way, we have the death of his doppelganger, this very loyal, patient presence who has been waiting for these 20 years. And then we have a little space break and we go back into Roman type, into the normal type. And we hear this, and importantly, again, it feels very first person because because Argus is telling us what is happening for him. The dark shadow of death closed down on me, the fate of black death seized me, and so on. Yet, in fact, I did not die, or only in the most limited sense. Athena, after placing me in such an unhappy and unfair position, to not for all purposes be remembered, to not feel once again, and for the last time, the comforting touch of a beloved hand upon my head, took pity on my poor dog's body and made me immortal. So I love this. I love the fact that Athena is entering the story. We heard before that she was the one who, who told Odysseus he needed to be disguised as a beggar. But in exchange for like this very sad, pathetic ending of Argus, she's now elevating him in a way. I mean, it's amazing because we have Homer, who is like this classical figure, but now we're moving to like a goddess. Like we're moving from the earthly realm to the like realm of gods and goddesses. It's giving even more importance to this character of the dog. Not only that, it's like this very important thing that she's doing. It was her last act before less marvelous minds took over and stripped the gods and goddesses of all their transformative powers. Incredible. I mean, this is Joy Williams just really using the gods and goddesses in a way that is giving her, meaning Williams, like so much authority. So we move on. With the speed and strength I once knew before my Odysseus went off to the wars that were so necessary to him, I now run freely and everywhere through all the years to be with my brothers and sisters at the moment when their brief lives are spent. So notably here, we're moving into the present tense in this beautiful way. And again, the moment's going to dilate. We hear Athena, she did this thing, made him immortal, and then she is pushed off the stage by lesser minds who are, now going to think of like one, this kind of like monotheistic kind of, cosmology where we're going to just have the one God instead of all of these gods. Again, if your grandfather and your father are both ministers, this is kind of a bold statement here. One I really love because Joy Williams is not afraid to push against, received notions. But we have this idea of him being free and being rewarded for his loyalty, which is exactly what the reader of the Odyssey wanted. And not only that, but Argus is going to be able to do this thing that is like what he was meant to do in life, which is to be beloved and to like be recognized and to really engage in a way that Odysseus did not engage with him. I now run freely and everywhere through all the years to be with my brothers and sisters at the moment when their brief lives are spent. Then he goes on, and he's now talking about his brothers and sisters, the dogs. Often the ones they have been devoted to are with them, making those human sounds of sorrow and reassurance, stroking and smoothing their fur, promising them that they will not be forgotten. So, and this is when he's comforting his brothers and sisters at the ends of their lives. And these are animals whose owners are doing what it was that Argus wished that Odysseus would have done. Often the ones they have been devoted to are with them, making those human sounds of sorrow and reassurance, stroking and smoothing their fur, promising them that they will not be forgotten. This is the heavenly situation, this moment of reviving love, and my heart always sheds happy tears when I witness it, as Athena, in her mercy, intended. As for my brothers and sisters who die neglected, bewildered, and alone, I, Argus, have been given the honor of guiding them on the next rondelay. Quick note here, I looked up rondelay. In that same interview with the British guy, he was saying how oftentimes Joy Williams will like toss these really unusual and interesting words in, and a couple of them he had to look up. And rondelay, in my mind, for some reason, I went straight to like thinking about like a hiking tour, and that is not in fact what it is. It's a circle dance. It comes from the French word for an old, very old circular kind of dance or song. So I love the fact that she's throwing in this word that it's not coming from Greek mythology, and it is making the reader think, but it's one that's like, it's a very pleasing word, and it evoked for me something that really worked well, although what it evoked was not quite right. And then he continues on. It is a strange journey we take, far more extraordinary than the adventures of Odysseus. We disassemble, we are restored, our trials are great, the obstacles many, but I remain with them until after long seeking, they find kindness and love recognized is returned. Such love endures beyond all our endings. It's important for them to know this. Athena told me. So again, we talked about the moment dilating, and we have this idea, this very satisfying thing about how like this dog is telling us what happens after death. He is immortal, and he's able to tell us that these very sort of loving, positive things happen, even for these creatures who die, miserable and alone and without their owners. It's a very like optimistic and satisfying way to close this whole thing. Though the story is not quite done, it ends in the most incredible way. So we have the dog saying, such love endures beyond all our endings. It's important for them to know this. Athena told me. She says, I am a good boy. Unbelievable. So good. We have this incredible moment where Joy Williams has plucked from like arguably the most important piece of literature, from the classical era. She has taken this humble creature and then moved beyond the idea of gods and goddesses and moved to immortality and moved way beyond, Odysseus and Penelope and all of those people. And we've had this very satisfying thing of like, we don't know why he was neglected, and we don't know why he had to die alone and unrecognized. But, well, he didn't die, because then Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, like elevates this creature. And then he does this incredible service where he is reassuring us that everything is fine after we die, even if we die miserably. Which, I mean, what could be more reassuring? And then this kind of high-flown thing that has reached this like incredible altitude is concluded and like brought down to earth in the most incredible way. This idea of ending it, she says, I am a good boy. Like this idea of good boy, it's like the sort of like most like banal, not banal, like it's the most kind of like plain and true and like meaningful thing that everyone says to their dog, like what a good boy. And it's so meaningful here, and yet it's also so plain and so sort of basic in the most beautiful way. It's also important here that we have Athena's voice and that it is in the present tense. It's so beautiful. This reminds me quite a bit of a poem called The Revenant by Billy Collins, which is also about a dog, and it's a dog after death. I think that dogs, and as a dog person, I this rings especially true with me, because there's such a purity of like to our love for them, and because their loyalty and their like love for us is so unconditional and so pure. There's a way that death around dogs is so sad and just so uncomplicated and just such a like pure kind of grief that a story like this is incredibly moving. This is a bit of a departure for Joy Williams. A lot of her work has to do with humans, but I love so much the masterful way that she has joined her voice literally to to Greek mythology and to classic literature in a way that is so skilled and so deft and so moving. So I'm going to, I'll free you right now and say thank you very much for tuning in. But if you want to hear me read the entire thing through, I will also indulge you in that now. Again, it's 3.5 pages. So it's not a long story, but you've also heard it as we've been moving along today already. And I hope that if this is the first Joy Williams you've heard, I hope you indulge in much more of her work. And if you're a longtime lover of Joy Williams, I certainly hope that you are going to read this new collection. And realize that this is both in some ways very indicative of what she writes, but also is just the very tip of what is an incredible iceberg. So again, thanks for tuning in and happy reading. Here we go, reading Argos one last time. Argos. Perhaps you've read of me. I am the hound, old Argos. I once belonged to the hero Odysseus some 2,800 years ago. Homer granted me a few lines in his epic. He presented me then in a pathetic light, cast away on piles of dung from mules and cattle infested with ticks, half dead from neglect. I had waited for my absent master for 20 years, and when he returned, he came in the guise of a beggar, a mangy tramp, a bag of bones. This was calculation, the deception, the final triumphant wile of the wily Odysseus. I alone recognized him. I thumped my tail in joy, though I hadn't the strength to drag myself an inch toward him. He did not acknowledge me. He did not place his hand on my bony head or stroke my withered flanks. A friendly touch from him would have meant the world to me, of course. I had often dreamed of his return, which I had long associated with happiness. I cannot tell you why his wife and son did not take care of me those long years, or why their servants were so cruel. There is much that animals do not understand. I do know, however, that Homer did not invent me. I was always Argos. It is Homer, indeed, who, in all probability, did not exist as an individual, his words being the imaginings of many. It was even said that Odysseus flicked away a tear when he beheld me, though I did not see it, as the hero had turned his back on me. This subterfuge was necessary for his success. So had the goddess Athena counseled him. To be recognized was to be betrayed. He strode away from me and into the palace halls to claim his kingdom, slay the insolent suitors, 100 of them he killed in an instant, and regain his wife Penelope. His triumph was thus achieved, and little happens after. As for me, this is how I am dismissed by the Homers. Then his destiny released old Argos, soon as he had lived to see Odysseus in the 20th year restored. The dark shadow of death closed down on me, the fate of Black Death seized me, and so on. Yet, in fact, I did not die, or only in the most limited sense. Athena, after placing me in such an unhappy and unfair position, to not, for all purposes, be remembered, to not feel once again, and for the last time, the comforting touch of a beloved hand upon my head, took pity on my poor dog's body and made me immortal. It was her last act before less marvelous minds took over and stripped the gods and goddesses of all their transformative powers. With the speed and strength I once knew before my Odysseus went off to the wars that were so necessary to him, I now run freely and everywhere through all the years to be with my brothers and sisters at the moment when their brief lives are spent. Often the ones they have been devoted to are with them, making those human sounds of sorrow and reassurance, stroking and smoothing their fur, promising them that they will not be forgotten. This is the heavenly situation, this moment of reviving love, and my heart always sheds happy tears when I witness it, as Athena in her mercy intended. As for my brothers and sisters who die neglected, bewildered, and alone, I, Argos, have been given the honor of guiding them on the next roundelay. It is a strange journey we take, far more extraordinary than the adventures of Odysseus. We disassemble, we are restored, our trials are great, the obstacles many, but I remain with them until after long seeking, they find kindness and love recognized is returned. Such love endures beyond all our endings. It's important for them to know this, Athena told me. She says, I am a good boy. So if you have hung on to the very end here, thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope that this deep dive into Argos by Joey Williams has been inspirational and satisfying, and that you come back to listen to another short story soon. Thanks for tuning in. Happy reading.